They burned me down in silence, so I rebuilt everything, quietly. That night at the family table, they looked at me like I was the disgrace of Grandpa's money. But what they didn't know was that money was never a lifeline. It was a seed, and I was just waiting for the right soil to grow. It was a Sunday evening, the kind of evening that should have felt comforting, warm, slow, nostalgic. Grandpa's kitchen still smelled like it always had: roasted rosemary chicken, baked sweet potatoes, a faint trace of cigar smoke from his old study. Everything looked the same, except for how I felt. I sat next to his chair, the one at the head of the table, carved with symbols he brought back from Vietnam. It was empty, but the tension it held was heavier than any person. I wasn't really hungry. I just pushed food around my plate. Across from me, Rachel, my cousin, had been eyeing me since I walked in. She wore success like it was perfume. MBA, corporate job, matching blazer. The kind of girl they point to at family gatherings and say, "Now that's how you do it." I wasn't wearing success. I was wearing a worn denim jacket, soft hands from days spent typing, not laboring. And more importantly, I was wearing the weight of their assumptions. Rachel finally leaned in, voice sweet, smile sharp. "Still doing the freelancing thing, Sophia? Must be nice, having Grandpa's monthly blessings." Laughter, polite and shallow, bubbled up from the table. Uncle Marcus smirked. Even Aunt Lisa tried to cover her smile with a sip of wine. I just breathed. Because silence, I've learned, can be louder than defense. And tonight, I knew I'd need it. They all knew Grandpa sent me $2,000 every month. What they didn't know was why. They thought I'd failed, that I'd collapsed after quitting my corporate job a year ago, that I'd moved into a tiny studio and buried myself in poetry and pity. But the truth? I left because I was being harassed, cornered in elevators, overlooked in boardrooms, gaslit when I spoke up. And when I finally broke, no one called, no one but Grandpa. He showed up on my doorstep that night with hot tea and silence. Didn't ask me why I left. Didn't ask what my next move was. He just said, "You remind me of your grandmother when she was your age. She didn't wait for permission to breathe either." Then he slipped an envelope under my journal. No lecture, no guilt, just a note that read, "Use this to find your center," not their approval. Since then, $2,000 had landed in my account on the first of every month. And with every deposit came another round of whispers from the family. The door creaked. Everyone straightened as Grandpa Harold walked in. 84 years old, still standing tall, cane in one hand, conviction in the other. His eyes scanned the table, then landed on me. He smiled, pulled back the heavy chair, and sat. "Sophia, that money I've been sending you. How have you been using it?" Silence. Not just the kind that fills a room, the kind that tightens the air, shrinks time, stretches seconds. Forks froze midair. Someone coughed. I could feel Rachel's smirk before I even looked at her. I looked at Grandpa. His face didn't accuse, it invited. He wasn't asking for accountability, he was asking for truth. And I remembered something he once said years ago when I was still a girl afraid to speak. "The world won't always hear your words, but it'll always feel your spirit. So speak, even when they expect your silence." So I did. I've used it to survive, Grandpa. But more than that, I've used it to build. There was a beat, and then Rachel scoffed, just loud enough for the table to hear. She leaned over and whispered to her brother, loud enough for me to feel. "Build what?" An Instagram following. The smirk. The shallow chuckle. The sting of a room that assumes you are nothing more than your latest bank balance. But I didn't break, because I'd already been broken, months ago. And when something's already broken, it no longer fears being shattered. I looked around the table, at people who thought love had to be earned through titles, degrees, and pay stubs. I'm not wasting your money, Grandpa, I said gently. I'm investing it in something bigger than a job title. I paused. You gave me money, but what you really gave me was time. Time to heal, to learn, to serve. Grandpa's eyes didn't blink, but they did soften. He placed his hand over mine and whispered, "Then I gave it to the right one." And in that moment, the room no longer mattered. Rachel's eye rolls, Uncle's scoffs, all of it faded because I remembered my value doesn't live in their expectations. It lives in the life I choose to build. From ashes, from quiet, from truth, silence. Not the peaceful kind, the sharp, surgical kind, the kind that slices through pretense and waits to see what bleeds. I could feel every pair of eyes waiting for me to stumble, to confirm what they already believed about me, that I was the weak one, the failed one, the one who couldn't make it on her own without Grandpa's monthly lifeline. But he didn't ask with judgment. His voice didn't carry accusation, just calm curiosity, the kind that says, I trust you, but speak for yourself. So I did. I've been using it to build something, Grandpa. Something real, quiet, but real. Rachel shifted in her seat. Uncle Marcus gave a half chuckle, like I'd just told a child's bedtime story. To build what, Sophia? He muttered. A blog? I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on Grandpa, and only Grandpa. Because when you're trying to stand up, you look at the one who still believes you can. I took a certification course in financial planning for the elderly, I said. Every Tuesday and Thursday, evenings, quietly. The laughter stopped. Confusion crept in. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't Instagram worthy. But it mattered because it helped me understand people like you, Grandpa. He tilted his head, curious now. People who've worked their whole lives, who deserve peace in their later years, but instead face confusion, fear, and exploitation when it comes to money. I paused. My heart beat steady, not out of fear, but out of release. Because this was the first time I'd said it out loud. The first time I'd allowed my progress to be seen, not for applause, but for clarity. Now I work with a nonprofit. We help low-income seniors restructure their pensions, protect their assets, and understand their healthcare costs. I looked at Grandpa again. I help people like you sleep better at night, and I couldn't have done it without your help. There was no applause. No, I'm proud of you from the others. Just stillness. The kind that comes when a mirror is held up and people don't like what they see. Because I hadn't just survived. I'd transformed, and quietly. That's what scared them most. Rachel finally broke the silence. So, what? You're a financial counselor now? She scoffed. Do you even get paid for that? I turned to her, not with anger, but with clarity. You chase titles, Rachel. I chase purpose. I may not wear a nameplate, but I go to bed knowing someone's grandmother won't be scammed this week because of me. Her face twisted, but she said nothing more. Because truth, when spoken softly and from the soul, doesn't need to be shouted. I looked at the table. All these people who once knew me only as the girl who wrote poetry in notebooks, who left her job without a plan, who cried at Thanksgiving. They didn't know the storms I'd weathered, the nights I spent learning tax codes, the weekends I gave to pro bono counseling. They only saw a girl with an empty resume, but I was building something richer than titles. I was building a life that aligned with my spirit. Grandpa leaned forward, his hands, worn, veined, strong, folded gently on the table. That's exactly what I hoped you'd do with it, he said. Turn help into healing. He smiled, and in that moment, everything felt still. Not because the others approved, but because he did. And his approval wasn't about status, it was about soul. After dinner, I stood to leave. No hugs, no backpats. Just nods. But as I passed Grandpa's chair, he took my hand. They won't say it, Sophia, he whispered. But they're seeing it now. I nodded. because I didn't need their validation. I wasn't that girl anymore. The girl who begged for acceptance, who mistook silence as failure, who thought love had to be proven. No, now I understood something deeper. You don't need to explain your journey to people who were never willing to walk beside you. You just need to keep walking, even if it's quietly, especially if it's quietly. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the curtains of my tiny apartment. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel small inside it. The walls hadn't changed. The floor still creaked, and the kitchen still had only one burner that worked right. But I felt different, because I'd finally said it. Everything I had been building in the shadows now had a voice. And though they didn't applaud, they heard me. Later that week, I got a message from Rachel. Just one line. Do you still have that link to the nonprofit you work with? No emojis, no small talk, but to me, it sounded like thunder. Because Rachel, the cousin who once mocked my choices, was now asking for help. Not publicly, not with humility, but asking nonetheless. I didn't gloat. I just sent her the link and added, let me know if you need help filling out their volunteer form. They always need hands. She didn't reply, but the message was already loud enough. 2 days later, I got a call from Aunt Lisa. She never calls. She's the kind of aunt who texts memes and likes photos but never really checks in. This time, she did. Hi, Sophia, she began. I just wanted to say that I didn't realize you were doing something so meaningful. I smiled quietly. She was struggling to find the right words. And that, in itself, was its own apology. You know how families can be, she added. We joke, we tease, sometimes we don't think about how it lands. I let her finish, then replied, It's okay, Aunt Lisa. I wasn't doing it for the applause anyway. She exhaled like someone had lifted a stone off her chest. Your grandpa's proud of you, you know. I know, I said. But more importantly, so am I. That evening, I sat alone on my tiny balcony, a chipped mug of chamomile tea in hand, watching the city lights blink like small prayers in the dark. I thought about the word apology, how people often confuse it with groveling or confession. But sometimes, the truest apologies come in whispers, in changed tones, in silent acknowledgments, in a shift of how they speak your name when you're not in the room. The next family gathering was Grandpa's birthday. I almost didn't go, not because I was still angry, but because I was afraid of being re-caged in their old expectations. But then I remembered what Grandpa had told me once when I was still in high school. If you never walk back into the room that broke you, you'll never get to see how strong you've become. So I went. The moment I stepped into the living room, I felt it. Not warmth, not coldness, but respect. They didn't run to hug me. They didn't clap or offer speeches, but they made space. They moved over on the couch. They handed me a plate without question. And when Grandpa gave his birthday toast, he looked around the room, glass raised, and said, To those who speak when it's hard, who build when no one watches, and who make this family better, even when they've been made to feel like they don't belong. He looked at me, and for the first time, everyone else did too. Not with pity, not with doubt, but with a new kind of silence, the good kind, the kind that listens. After dinner, Rachel walked up to me. She had her arms crossed, eyes avoiding mine, like a kid rehearsing a speech. So I signed up to volunteer, she said. At the nonprofit, thought maybe I could learn something. I smiled. You will. She hesitated, then added, And I was wrong. About you, I guess I didn't really know what strength looked like. I didn't hug her. I didn't need to. Because that moment wasn't about reconciliation. It was about release. Sometimes people won't say I'm sorry the way you need them to. Sometimes they won't admit how deeply they wounded you. But they'll come back in quiet gestures, in softened eyes, in whispered apologies, and if you've healed, you'll hear them, even when they're silent. I left that night with no baggage, not because they finally accepted me, but because I no longer needed them to. Forgiveness isn't about excusing the past. It's about freeing yourself from carrying it forward. And when I walked past Grandpa's chair, the one carved with age, memory, and wisdom, he stopped me. "Still building?" he asked. I nodded. "Every day." He smiled. "Then don't stop. You're not just building your life, Sophia. You're rebuilding our name." After Grandpa's birthday dinner, something in me shifted. Not dramatically, not like a movie scene where the underdog wins and the crowd erupts in applause. It was quieter than that, subtler, like the feeling of a healed wound you no longer flinch from when touched. I had walked into that house fearing their judgment. I walked out owning my story. And now, it was time to grow beyond the need for anyone else's permission. The next Monday, I called my supervisor at the nonprofit. "I want to launch something," I said, "a financial literacy series for seniors who don't know where to begin." He paused, surprised maybe, then replied, "We've needed that for years. You sure you're ready to lead it?" I took a deep breath. I've been preparing for this in silence long enough. Within weeks, I was standing in front of my first workshop group, 23 elderly men and women seated in a church basement with plastic chairs and worn notepads. Some wore hearing aids. Others brought their adult children to help translate. They weren't there for inspiration. They were there for survival. And I had something to offer. Not just spreadsheets or budget plans, but clarity, compassion, confidence. One woman, Gloria, stayed behind after the first session. "I don't trust banks," she whispered. "When my husband died, they froze everything. I didn't even have bus fare to get to the funeral home." I sat with her for an hour, not just explaining her rights, but hearing her pain. Because people don't just need information, they need someone to see them. Over time, the series grew. Word spread, churches called, community centers reached out. They didn't ask for titles or credentials, they asked for me. The woman who spoke gently, explained simply, and never made them feel stupid for not knowing how to read a credit report. I wasn't changing the world, but I was changing their world, one line item at a time. Rachel showed up to one of the sessions one afternoon. She stood at the back, silent, observing. Afterward, she pulled me aside. "I always thought power meant being loud, owning rooms, speaking over others." She looked around. "But this room listens to you. They lean in, and I get it now." I smiled. "Power doesn't always roar, Rachel. Sometimes it whispers, and people listen harder." Around that time, I got a call from a journalist, local news. They were doing a feature on financial literacy efforts in underfunded neighborhoods. "We heard about your series," she said. "Mind if we sit in and maybe do a piece?" I hesitated, not because I didn't want the story told, but because I didn't want to become the story. So much of what I'd built felt sacred in its quiet. I feared exposure might cheapen it. But Grandpa had once told me, "The fruit of your effort isn't yours to hoard. If your tree grows strong, let others sit in its shade." So I said yes. The article came out the following month. It wasn't flashy, just a thoughtful piece about a young woman helping the elderly navigate the intimidating world of finance. There was a photo, me in front of a whiteboard, explaining compound interest to a group of gray-haired learners with wide eyes. The headline read, "She used a $2,000 monthly gift to change hundreds of lives." I didn't show the article to anyone, but someone did, because Grandpa called. "Sophia," he began. I read it. I waited. He was never one to exaggerate. "You know," he continued, "I once thought I was helping you survive. Turns out I was helping you build a lighthouse." I said nothing, just breathed deeply, because sometimes love sounds like recognition. Weeks passed. The workshop became a program, then a department, then a separate initiative funded by a grant I didn't even apply for, one that found me. The name? The Quiet Ledger. Because not all balance sheets are about numbers. Some are about dignity, peace, legacy. I started getting letters from people I'd never met, a woman in Arizona, a retired nurse in Michigan, a war veteran in Georgia. My granddaughter read your article to me. I didn't know people like you existed. I thought I was too old to start over. Thank you for showing me I wasn't. You're the reason I opened my first bank account at 72. I kept them all in a wooden box beside my desk, the same desk Grandpa gave me when I moved out years ago. Every night, before I turned out the lights, I would read one. Not for praise, but for perspective. Because I never wanted to forget I wasn't here because I won. I was here because I endured. Because I chose quiet construction over loud collapse. Because I answered the silence with action. And still I remained invisible to many. They saw the headlines, the numbers, the impact. But they didn't see the nights I cried on the floor. The hours I studied while everyone else was asleep. The meals I skipped to afford textbooks. And that was okay, because what I'd built wasn't for them. It was for the ones who knew what it meant to rebuild in silence. There's a strange thing that happens when the world finally turns to look at you. After years of being dismissed, overlooked, and silenced, suddenly they pull out a chair. Not just any chair, but one with your name carved into it. And they say, "We've been waiting for you." But you know they haven't, because you remember every room that ignored you, every table you weren't invited to, every silence that wasn't peaceful but punishing. So when that chair finally appears, you don't just sit, you pause, you choose. Months after the Quiet Ledger received its first major grant, I was invited to speak at a national summit. A room full of policymakers, nonprofit directors, financial executives, men in suits, women in pearls, people who spoke in acronyms and billion-dollar budgets. I was the youngest one on the list, the only one without a formal title, no PhD, no letters behind my name, just Sophia Evans, community advocate. That was enough for me, but I wasn't sure if it was enough for them. I almost said no. But Grandpa sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same one where he used to read the newspaper with coffee and silence. And he said, "Do you remember what I told you the night I gave you that first envelope?" I nodded. "You said it wasn't so I could live. It was so I could rebuild." He leaned in. "Now that you've rebuilt, it's time to raise the roof a little," he smiled. And just like that, I said yes. The day of the summit, I wore a simple black dress, no designer label, no glam squad, just me, the version that had survived the silence. Backstage, a woman approached me. "You're Sophia, right? Your story, the article about the seniors, it made me cry." She was the keynote speaker, a CEO of something massive I couldn't even pronounce. And yet she was crying over a program I started in a basement with 23 folding chairs. That's when I knew this wasn't about scale. It was about soul. When I stepped onto the stage, I didn't read from notes. I didn't quote statistics. I told a story about Gloria, who learned how to protect her husband's pension after years of being ignored. About Mr. Lionel, who had never touched a smartphone, but now used one to check his health coverage. I talked about how silence almost swallowed me whole, how I learned to speak, not to be heard, but to heal. And then I said this: you can build programs, you can build platforms, but if you don't build people, you've built nothing. When I stepped down, the room stood, not because I dazzled them, but because I reminded them that somewhere someone is waiting to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, quietly. After the summit, I got dozens of emails, job offers, speaking gigs, podcasts, even a university asked me to guest lecture. But I turned most of them down because I wasn't interested in becoming a brand. I was interested in becoming useful. I did say yes to one thing, though, a board seat for a regional credit union that served underbanked communities. They said they needed someone with a community lens, someone who didn't just read spreadsheets, but understood the people behind them. And when I walked into that room, they had a chair with my name on it, literally. Sophia Evans, Member Community Advocacy. I sat down, not because I needed the title, but because I knew what it felt like to be left standing, and I wanted to make sure that no one else was. At the end of the first board meeting, one of the directors leaned over. "You know, you don't talk much in the room," he said. "But when you do, people listen." I smiled. "That's because I don't speak to be heard. I speak when I have something that might help someone." He looked at me and nodded, like he understood, like maybe he used to be someone who didn't. One evening, months later, I sat with Grandpa on the porch. The sun was dipping behind the rooftops. Cicadas hummed in the quiet. My head rested lightly on his shoulder. "You've done good," he whispered. "You helped me believe I could," I replied. He chuckled. "No, Sophia, you already believed. I just gave you permission to say it out loud." As the sky turned from gold to indigo, I looked at the stars and thought, how many people are sitting in silence, holding on to ideas, pain, dreams, just waiting for someone to see them? And I promised myself, if I ever saw someone standing without a seat, I'd make room, not out of pity, but out of memory, because I remember what it felt like to stand beside an empty chair and wonder if I belonged. Now that I had one with my name on it, I wasn't going to waste it. Not on power, not on ego, but on purpose, because they burned me down in silence. So I rebuilt everything, quietly, and now I make space for others to rise, quietly, steadily, and with all the grace I once had to beg for. They say people want to be seen, but no one tells you what it costs to be visible. To walk into a room and feel eyes not just watching, but measuring, praising you on the outside while quietly asking if you'll stumble on the inside. After the summit and the article, things changed. I was invited to panels, interviews, coffee chats with CEOs. I became the face of a movement I never intended to lead. People called me an advocate, a thought leader, a visionary. But I never called myself any of those things. I was still just Sophia, the girl who once cried into a cup of instant ramen because she couldn't afford therapy. The girl who used to walk to the library in the rain to save bus fare. I hadn't forgotten. But some days, I feared the world had. A month into my new board seat, a marketing director from the credit union approached me. "We're thinking of putting you on a billboard," she said. "Your story is inspiring. You'd be the perfect brand ambassador." I smiled politely, but inside, something pulled back. I didn't build the quiet ledger to become a brand. I built it so people like Gloria could sleep without clutching their purse at night. "I'm flattered," I told her, "but I'd rather stay at eye level, not above it." She looked confused, but I was sure of my answer, because visibility without grounding is dangerous. I started noticing something strange. Some of the new people in my circle weren't there to help. They were there to be seen with me, to say they knew me, to use my voice, not amplify it. One man invited me to co-host a podcast on empowering communities, then spent the whole meeting talking about his personal brand. Another woman asked me to endorse her new coaching program for seniors. The price? $499 per session. I asked her, "How many seniors do you know who can afford that?" She didn't respond, just smiled. A polished, rehearsed smile. That's when I realized the spotlight can be just as blinding as the shadows. One night, I called Grandpa. "I feel like I'm walking a tightrope," I said. "Trying to be useful, but not used. Trying to speak truth, but not become a headline. He paused, then said something I'll never forget. Child, the world will always want to borrow your fire. Just make sure they don't steal your flame. I closed my eyes. Because that was it. I was afraid of losing what made this real. That weekend, I canceled 3 speaking engagements. I spent the time revisiting community centers, sitting in the rooms where it all started, listening, not talking. Gloria was still there. She brought cookies this time. Mr. Lionel had printed out a budget worksheet he made on his own. These people didn't care about articles or panels. They cared that I showed up, that I remembered their names, that I still answered their calls. And I did. Always. Because they weren't my audience. They were my anchor. I began rewriting how I showed up in public. I said no more often. I redirected spotlights toward the community. Every time someone asked to interview me, I said only if I can bring one of my seniors with me to speak. Some said yes, some said no. But that simple boundary helped me stay me. One day, Rachel visited my office. She sat across from me, fiddling with her bracelet. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded slowly. "Actually, no. I feel like I've been chasing noise. And you've built something from silence." I didn't say anything. She needed the space to say it all. I started volunteering more, but I still feel like I'm performing, like I don't know what's real anymore. I reached for a sticky note, wrote something on it, slid it across the table. She picked it up. "Real doesn't need to be loud," she smiled. And in her eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Humble curiosity, the kind that always precedes change. Later that night, I wrote in my journal, "Fame asks for your image, purpose asks for your presence. I choose purpose, every time." And then I closed the book, because I didn't need to go viral. I just needed to go true. In a world full of curated voices and personal brands, sometimes the most radical thing you can be is honest. And I was ready to keep building, not for approval, not for applause, but for people who still live in the quiet, still suffer in silence, still wonder if anyone sees them. And when they ask me how I made it, I won't say I fought for attention. I'll say I stayed grounded. I spoke when it mattered. And I never sold the party that remembered what it felt like to have nothing but faith. It had been almost 3 years. 3 years since I packed my box in silence, walked out of that corporate office with tear-stained cheeks and a resignation letter no one read. 3 years since I walked away from the job that broke me and the manager who lit the match. I never thought I'd see him again. But life has a strange sense of timing, and sometimes closure doesn't knock. It walks in unannounced. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The Quiet Ledger had just moved into a shared workspace downtown. Glass walls, high ceilings, old wood floors that creaked with charm. I was reviewing applications for our next community finance class when the front desk pinged my intercom. "Sophia, there's someone here to see you." Says his name is Darren Woods. The name made me freeze. Darren, my old boss. The man who once told me, "You're too sensitive for leadership. Clients prefer people who don't get emotional. Maybe you should stick to creative roles, less pressure." The man who watched me be cornered in meetings, dismissed in brainstorms, and passed over for promotions, then asked me to be a team player. I almost told the receptionist to send him away. But something in me, something steady and healed, said, "Let him see who you've become." So I said yes. He walked in wearing the same kind of suit, pressed, confident, slightly hurried. But this time, I wasn't sitting at his mercy. I was sitting at my own desk. He offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Sophia, wow, it's been a long time." I nodded. 3 years. He looked around the space. "You've built something here." I didn't reply. Let the silence do what words couldn't. He sat down across from me. No power posture, no clipboard, just a man with something on his chest. I read about your work, he said. The programs, the seniors, the impact. He paused. I didn't realize you had that in you. I smiled gently. Most people don't until they see you in a room you didn't need their permission to walk into. He winced, and for a moment I saw it. Not guilt, not regret, but recognition. I came to say I'm sorry, he said, eyes lowered. I didn't listen. I didn't protect you. And I definitely didn't believe in you. I let those words hang in the air because I remembered the girl who used to pray for those words, who wrote apology speeches in her head during sleepless nights. But now, I didn't need them. Thank you, I said. Not bitter, not sarcastic, just real. But you should know, I'm not here because you doubted me. I'm here because I stopped doubting myself. He looked down, and maybe that was the real apology. He stood up, brushing imaginary dust from his jacket. If you ever need support, connections, funding, I'd be happy to help. I stood too. What I need, I said slowly, is for people in power to start listening before women have to break to be believed. He met my eyes, this time with silence, but not the kind that judges, the kind that hears. After he left, I sat back down at my desk, and for the first time, I felt light, not because I'd won, not because he finally saw me, but because I didn't carry the weight of needing him to. That night, I journaled. Sometimes healing isn't a moment, it's 1,000 quiet choices to stop bleeding for people who never asked where it hurt. And I slept deeply, not because everything was fixed, but because I didn't need fixing anymore. The next morning, I arrived early to the community center. Mr. Lionel was already there, reading a flyer. You look different today, he said. I let go of something heavy, I replied. He smiled. That's the thing about burdens, Sophia. You don't always realize how long you've been carrying them until your back finally straightens. That day, I stood in front of a room full of seniors, advocates, volunteers, and I spoke, not as someone with a point to prove, not as a survivor of corporate injustice, but as a builder of bridges, of dignity, of quiet revolutions, because revenge doesn't always wear anger. Sometimes it wears peace. It came in the form of an email. Subject line, invitation, National Broadcast Panel on Workplace Injustice. They were producing a live segment on toxic corporate culture, inviting former employees to share their stories, name names, expose the system, and they wanted me. The producer wrote, "Your story is powerful. Your former employer's name still carries weight. This is a chance to hold them accountable, publicly." Part of me flinched. The old wound stirred, because I remembered it all. The meetings where I was spoken over, the late-night emails that bled into weekends, the performance reviews that praised my work but capped my progress. And above all, the way they made me feel small, then invisible. This was it, a chance to return the humiliation in front of cameras on national TV, to finally say, "You tried to bury me, but I grew anyway." But I didn't reply, not right away. Instead, I sat with the question, what does justice really look like when your soul is already free? That evening, I visited Grandpa. He was trimming his rose bushes, humming something old and forgotten. I stood beside him and asked, if someone gave you a microphone to expose every person who ever wronged you, would you take it? He didn't look up. Depends. On what? I asked. He clipped a branch, gently, precisely, on whether I wanted to win or be well. I didn't say anything, because I already knew my answer. 2 days later, I replied to the email, "Thank you for the invitation, but I've chosen to use my voice to build, not burn." I hit send and exhaled, because it wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Still, the world doesn't always understand that kind of strength. I got messages from friends, "You're passing up your moment. They deserve to be exposed. Why protect them?" But I wasn't protecting them. I was protecting me, my peace, my purpose, my path. I wasn't afraid to speak truth, I already had. But I didn't want to build a platform on ashes. I wanted to build it on something that could grow. And rage doesn't grow roots, it just scorches the soil. The following week, I held a workshop called Unspoken Wounds. We didn't talk about corporations, we talked about healing. A woman named Carla cried as she told us about being let go after 25 years. No goodbye, no gratitude. A man named Jerome shared how he still flinched when he heard his old boss's ringtone. I listened. We all did. And then I said this: you don't have to destroy what hurt you to prove you've healed. Because healing isn't about revenge, it's about release. Later that night, Rachel called me. You know that segment you turned down? She asked. Someone else went on. They named names. It's all over Twitter now. I nodded. Do you regret it? She asked. I thought for a second. No, because they needed a microphone. I needed my mirror. She went quiet, then said, I don't know how you do it. I smiled. I stopped needing to prove I was strong. I just started living like I already was. The following month, something unexpected happened. The company I once worked for, the one I walked away from in silence, reached out. A new executive, new values. They were launching an initiative to audit and transform their workplace culture. And they wanted me to consult. They didn't ask me to forgive, they asked me to guide. The old Sophia would have said no, would have scoffed. But this Sophia, the one who had sat with elders and heard their fears, the one who had mentored women trying to rebuild from nothing, she said yes, not because she forgot, but because she had become someone they couldn't ignore. My first day back in that building, I walked through the revolving door with my head held high. The air smelled the same. The walls hadn't changed, but I had. I didn't feel anger or vindication, just clarity. The girl who left here was broken, I thought. The woman returning is whole. And that was all the justice I ever needed. That night, I journaled. Sometimes revenge looks like power, but true victory feels like peace. Let others shout, I'll whisper, and still be heard. I never told many people about that offer, not because I was hiding it, but because not every triumph needs a headline. Some victories live in your spine, in your ability to walk away, unbitter, unbent, unchanged by the flames, except for the light they left in your eyes. It started with a letter, handwritten, folded neatly, no return address. Inside, it read, Miss Evans? My name is Danny. I'm 22. I watched a video about your work, and I haven't stopped thinking about it. I don't know where to begin. I just know I want to help people like you do. There was a pause between each line, like she was catching her breath while writing. I was raised thinking success meant being seen, but your story made me wonder, what if it means seeing others instead? She ended with, if you ever have time for tea, I'd love to learn. I folded the letter and placed it on my windowsill, right where the light hits in the late afternoon, because something about it felt sacred. A week later, I met her. She showed up early, hair pulled back, fingers fidgeting with a chipped coffee mug, eyes full of hope and fear. I'd seen those eyes before, in my own mirror. Danny didn't want attention. She wanted direction. Everyone tells me I'm too soft, she said, staring into her tea. That I care too much, that I'll burn out. I smiled. They told me that too. Were they right? She asked. I took a breath. Only when I tried to be what they wanted. She looked up, and in that moment, something settled between us. Not as mentor and student, but as two women who understood the cost of compassion. I brought her to one of our workshops the next week. She sat in the back, notebook in hand, listening to stories that cracked the room open. A woman who hadn't spoken to her son in 5 years because of a debt. A man who carried his late wife's medical bills like a backpack of shame. A grandmother who said, I never knew peace could be taught. Danny cried, not loudly, not dramatically, Just one tear slipped down her cheek when no one was looking. But I saw it, and I knew. She wasn't here to perform. She was here to stay. After the session, I asked her, "Do you still think you're too soft?" She shook her head. "I think maybe softness is what this world is starving for." I nodded. "Then feed it, quietly, consistently, with clean hands and clear eyes." That night, I opened my journal. I wrote, "The most powerful thing we can do with our healing is make it safe for someone else to begin theirs." Because legacies don't start with applause, they start with permission. And Danny, she didn't need a platform, she needed a place. Over the next few months, she shadowed me, took notes, asked hard questions, helped when stories got heavy, laughed when the room forgot how. She didn't want shortcuts, she wanted roots, and I gave them to her. Not by teaching, but by being. One afternoon, she stayed behind after a session. The room was empty, the sun low. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always." "Do you ever feel like your light might fade? That one day you'll stop being enough?" I walked to the board, picked up a piece of chalk, drew a small circle. "This is a flame," I said. "When you keep it to yourself, it stays small, fragile." Then I drew another, and another, until the board was filled with circles. "But when you pass it on, it doesn't diminish, it multiplies." I don't worry about fading, Danny, because I know where the light goes after me. She looked at the board for a long time, then said, "I want to be one of those flames." And in that moment, I knew I already was. Legacy isn't carved in marble. It's passed through hands, quietly, humbly, unseen by most, but it lives in rooms where names are never mentioned, but their fingerprints remain. Weeks later, Danny led her first session. I sat in the back this time, watched as she stumbled, then recovered, laughed too nervously, then softened. But the room listened, because the light doesn't need polish, it just needs presence. Afterward, she came to me wide-eyed. "Did I do okay?" I smiled. "You did better than okay. You showed up fully." She nodded, then said the one thing that told me everything I needed to know. "I didn't try to be you. I tried to be honest." That night, as I turned off the lights at the center, I stood for a moment in the dark. Not afraid, not lonely, just still. Because I finally understood, it was never about becoming the brightest. It was about making sure the light kept moving. And it was. Danny was proof. And after her, there would be more. I walked home under a sky full of quiet stars, each one a reminder that the most beautiful light doesn't scream, doesn't demand. It just shows up when the world needs it most. It was a Sunday afternoon, the same kind of afternoon I used to dread: family gatherings, polite smiles, sideways glances. But this time, I felt different walking in, not because they had changed, but because I had. The table was already set when I arrived: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, peach cobbler cooling by the window. Rachel was in the kitchen, arranging silverware. She looked up and smiled. Not forced, not performative, just real. "Glad you're here," she said. "Grandpa saved your seat." I walked into the dining room, and there it was. The chair. The one that had once felt like a spotlight and a judgment seat all in one. But this time, it was just a chair. Nothing more, nothing less. Grandpa sat beside it, sipping his tea. He looked older, slower, but steady, as always. I kissed his cheek and sat down. "Feels strange?" he asked. "Familiar," I said, "but not heavy." He nodded. "That's what healing does. It turns weight into wisdom." Dinner was calm. No comments about freelancing, no sarcastic digs about retirement funds, just stories, laughter, the clink of forks on porcelain. At one point, Rachel leaned over and whispered, "Did you know Danny's leading her own program now?" I smiled. "She was born to lead. She just needed someone to remind her." Rachel paused, then said, "So did I." That was an apology I didn't need, but deeply received. After dessert, Grandpa stood up, cane in hand, eyes brighter than ever. Before we all run off, he said, I have one more thing. He motioned toward the bookshelf. Rachel walked over and returned with a small box, carved wood, worn edges. Grandpa opened it and pulled out a nameplate, not for an office, not for a plaque, but for a chair. He held it out to me. Sophia Evans, it read, builder of quiet legacies. The room went silent. This wasn't just a gift, it was a recognition, a naming of something that had long been true, but never spoken aloud. My hands shook as I took it. What's this for? I asked. For when I'm not here, he said. That chair's yours now. My throat tightened because I remembered how I once sat there, barely breathing, feeling like a burden wrapped in borrowed money. And now I was being trusted to carry. I didn't cry at the table. I waited until I got home, sat in the quiet, held that nameplate like it was both armor and altar, and then I placed it on my desk, right beside the letters from Gloria, Mr. Lionel, Danny, and so many others. It didn't need a spotlight. It had already landed where the light belonged. That night, I wrote in my journal one last time for the season, healing is a circle, not a line. We return to the place we once broke, not to relive it, but to redeem it. The chair didn't change. I did. Months later, I visited the community center alone, walked into the empty hall where it all began. The folding chairs were still there. I sat in one, closed my eyes, and imagined someone else walking in, young, nervous, full of fire, but unsure where to place it. I imagined making space for her, scooting my chair, smiling gently, saying what I wish someone had said to me years ago. You don't need to be ready. You just need to be real. The rest will rise to meet you. And so I rise, still quietly, still gently, but no longer alone, because for every burden I laid down, someone else picked up a seed, and the garden grows. The chair is no longer empty, not because someone filled it, but because it became a symbol, not of where I sat, but of what I stood for. And so when people ask me, how did you survive what they did to you? I smile. I didn't just survive. I built a place for others to sit beside me. They burned me down in silence, so I rebuilt everything, quietly. And in that quiet, I became the chair, the one that waits, the one that welcomes, the one that never forgets where it came from, but no longer hurts because of it. And I've come to understand something. Living with Dharma, with inner truth, doesn't mean preaching or being perfect or knowing all the answers. It simply means this: to choose compassion when revenge would feel easier, to stay silent when pride wants to scream, to walk away in peace when the world dares you to burn it all down. I used to think strength meant winning arguments, proving my worth, taking back the room. But now I know. True strength is when your soul stays clean, even when your heart has every reason to turn bitter. They once pushed me away from that chair, told me I didn't belong at the table, made me feel like my worth depended on their permission. But now, I don't sit to be accepted. I don't stand to prove anything. I sit when it's time to listen. I stand when it's time to lift others. And in this quiet, I don't carry pride, I carry peace, because they burned me down in silence. So I rebuilt everything, not with fire, but with light. And that is the quiet path of those who walk with soul, not ego. They burned me down in silence, so I rebuilt everything quietly. This is Burn Then Built, and this is where we rise, quietly.